Today we're going to talk about Sega and what their biggest mistake, in my opinion, was, which ultimately led to their downfall. Now, there are a lot of mistakes that Sega made that led to their ultimate demise, but I think there was one thing in particular that really accelerated that. Some people talk about the Sega 32X and the Sega Saturn releasing at the same time being the one thing that really killed Sega's reputation. It ruined consumer confidence, and that's ultimately what led to the failure of the Sega Saturn, and it led to the failure of the Dreamcast, and those two things ultimately led to Sega dropping out of the console race. But if I had to pinpoint the one thing that really hurt Sega the most, like out of all the mistakes that Sega made, out of the stupid decisions that they made, releasing all these add-ons for the Genesis, releasing the Saturn and then discontinuing it very shortly after, and of course with the Dreamcast not really being up to par with the PlayStation 2, I really think that the biggest mistake that Sega made out of all of those things is definitely what they did with the Sega Saturn. Really, I mean, you look at the Sega Saturn, that's really where everything just went to shit. What they could have done with the Saturn, never mind the 32X, okay? Yeah, they released the 32X at the same time as the Saturn, and that has mostly to do with Sega of America and Sega Japan pretty much competing with one another. And I think Sega just got too cocky, thinking that, they could experiment with all this shit, and they would be okay in the long run because Sega, at that time, pretty much dominated the video game industry towards the end of the 5th generation. But yeah, I think ultimately what it was in E3, I think it was E3 1997, where they famously said, the Sega Saturn is not in our future. And I really think that's what ultimately killed Sega's reputation and really led to Sega pretty much going out of business. Because look, if the Sega Saturn did okay, and even if the Dreamcast performed awfully, they could have still rebounded. Look at Nintendo with the Wii U. If Nintendo released failed console after failed console, they would be out of the race by now. But what they do is that usually they rely so much on the gimmicks, which can be hit or miss. It could be really successful like the Wii, or it could be a total bust like the Wii U. But the fact that they keep having those periods of major success, like with the Wii and currently with the Switch, releasing failed products like the Virtual Boy, like even the GameCube to an extent was a commercial failure, and of course the Wii U. They're still able to recoup those losses because they're okay. The last console that they made before the Wii U was a huge success. So when you release 2 failed consoles in a row, you're just, you're not going to succeed. And you're going to have to drop out of the console race. And it's really a shame that that's what happened with Sega, because I mentioned this during the debate with Bullet Barry on exclusives. And I briefly mentioned Sega because it's actually a very important point to make. You see, me and Barry, remember we were debating on exclusives, and I pretty much brought up my whole position on this debate was that exclusives were actually very important for the gaming industry because it's essentially the driving force for competition, okay? And I told him, look, do you really think that games like Sonic the Hedgehog, Mario, Zelda, those types of games that were released in the late 80s, early 90s, do you really think, these are games that defined the gaming industry as we know it today? Do you really think without that incentive for them to compete with each other that those games would have ever existed? Because his whole philosophy is that he pretty much believes in this utopian crap that if you just get rid of exclusives altogether and just let them make games for all platforms, then the game quality is going to be the same. And I told him, just look at Sega. Compare Sega in the 1990s the mid to late 1990s, compare them to right now, can you honestly say that Sega makes better games today than they did back during the Dreamcast era, during the, I'm not going to say the Saturn, the Genesis era? Do you really think that you can actually compare Sega back then in terms of first-party titles to Sega now with the games that they're releasing on all platforms? And I brought that up because it's very important. It's really something to think about when people say, oh, exclusives are awful for the industry. Meanwhile, the fact that the game is exclusive and it's only on that one platform, these first-party publishers really have that incentive to make the games amazing. And that's what we see with games like The Last of Us and Spider-Man and a whole bunch of other games. And Sega is a great example of this. But ultimately, what really killed Sega was definitely the Saturn. Because look, they could have fucked up with the 32X. They could have still done that fuck up. Because even if they didn't release the 32X, the Saturn probably still would have failed. Because it just had very complex architecture. It wasn't even nearly as powerful as its competitors. And it's just, the Sega Saturn was just a mess. It was just an absolute mess. They had absolutely no idea what they were doing. And at that time, they were trying to do some little experiment where they released multiple consoles. They wanted to release the Sega Neptune as well, which was like an entry-level version into the Saturn. They pretty much tried to PC the console industry, and it just blew up in their face. The 3DO company also tried to do that, and we all know how that went. And now it seems like Microsoft is also trying to do that, and they are probably going to meet the same fate. I might talk about that in a later video, about why I think that the next generation is going to be Microsoft's last. And this is going to be their last rodeo in the console manufacturing industry. But yeah, I think if Sega would have at least broke even on the Sega Saturn, the Dreamcast would have been just fine. And if the Dreamcast would have been just fine, then we wouldn't have had Sega forced to drop out. Because actually, you look at the Dreamcast sales, I mean, in 2 years or so, they sold 10 million units, which, granted, isn't amazing, but isn't awful enough to drop out the entire industry either. So, yeah, the Sega Saturn is ultimately what caused that, because if the Sega Saturn at least broke even, Sega wouldn't have ran completely out of money. Bernie Stolar and his dumb business decisions that really just fucked up Sega. He was in charge towards the end of the Genesis life cycle, and pretty much the entire Saturn life cycle, and he was the one that said Saturn is not in our future. Stupid. So stupid. I can't, I know, you always think about these things in hindsight, and I'm not going to say that if I was in charge of Sega, I would have turned it around, and Sega would still be around today. But it still just seems to me like it's just so obvious that the mistakes that they made just were never going to benefit them. And it was going to hurt them. Ultimately, they just got too arrogant. And the civil war between the American branch of Sega and the Japanese is also what killed it. There were many factors that destroyed Sega, don't get me wrong. The Sega Saturn did fail, and that ultimately made Sega go practically bankrupt. And they did come out with the Dreamcast, but it didn't take off as much as it did to save Sega. And then some people would say, well, if the Dreamcast took off like the PS2, Sega would still be around. But yeah, that's just ultimately the root cause of Sega's demise was the Saturn. Because that was an entire generation of consoles that they completely dropped the ball on. And then they had momentum going into the next one, but they really didn't. They didn't really make a dent in the industry. I mean, they did innovate. Don't get me wrong. I mean, Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2 were practically masterpieces. Well, I say that even though you had the fishing simulator with Big the Cat. But you know what I'm saying? They had very good quality titles. Shenmue very good quality titles for the Sega Dreamcast, and the Dreamcast was a very good console, and it's held in very high regards today. And it's very rare that you see very good consoles that are universally loved by the community that failed as much as the Dreamcast did. And people point at Sony, people point at other things, but ultimately, Sega did this to themselves. If Sony's DVD player didn't kill Sega because the GameCube didn't have a DVD player, but the N64 did just fine. I mean, it didn't really do anywhere nearly as good as their competition, the PS1. But I just think it's silly that people blame Sony, like to blame other companies for Sega's own downfall. And yes, it is their own downfall. They caused it themselves. You can't blame other companies for their own their own mistakes. It's not Sony's fault that Sega didn't know what the fuck they were doing with the Saturn. It's not Sony's fault that they just made stupid business decisions throughout the mid to late 90s. That's not Sony's fault at all. Sony definitely accelerated Sega's demise, don't get me wrong. Sony definitely did play a role. Sony's entry into the market definitely did play a role in Sega's demise, don't get me wrong. But when people point the finger at Sony, saying it was Sony and only Sony, or it was mainly Sony that caused Sega's demise, is just not very accurate, because if they released the system, they knew what the hell they were doing, actually put games on the system, because the Saturn didn't even have any games on it. Even if, the Saturn was underpowered and it was a pain in the ass to develop with, but if they released those quality Sonic titles that were on the Genesis, and they were planning on doing that, but they kept canceling the games, then the Saturn probably would have done better. And if they, the 32X was another thing too. People bought the 32X and then, oh yeah, a few months later the Sega Saturn was out. It's just like, that totally killed consumer confidence, don't get me wrong, but ultimately, everything leads back to the Sega Saturn, and that system was such a huge commercial failure that that's really what led to Sega's ultimate demise. That's what it was. So, yeah. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. If you agree with everything I've said, if you disagree, I'd like to know in the comments. Do you think that the Sega Saturn is ultimately what led to Sega's demise, or was it something else? Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys later.